2000. Lenny and Ashford, wait a moment. I know you're politically homeless. I'm going to come to that in just a second with you. Let me first introduce our paper reviewers this evening. Hello to Baz Ramaya. And Baz, I don't know if you fancy introducing yourself to all our listeners. I'm sure they'll be very pleased to have you on board. And thank you very much for sparing us some of your time this evening as well. I've kind of told you what the perhaps main topic of our conversation is this evening. So over to you. Will you be glad to see the back of Boris Johnson or not? Hello.
And thanks so much for having me back on. I'm head of policy at the Centre for Education and Youth and a former teacher. And from my perspective, Boris Johnson's exit is long overdue. He's been electorally and politically toxic for the Conservative Party for a long time now. But I don't personally rejoice at his exit because fundamentally, even though he's openly corrupt, dishonest, and his leadership is likely responsible for tens of thousands of excessive deaths through poor governance and policy making during the pandemic, he's probably now going to go on to do the lecture circuit in America, where if previous experience is anything to go by, he's going to be paid £400,000 a lecture. That's what David Cameron and Theresa May have gone and done. He'll probably get a very well-paid job on Talk TV or GB News, running a very widely watched political chat show, or indeed writing at the Telegraph. And it's very possible he'll continue to act as a lobbyist and an advocate for industry in Westminster. So while I think it's good in some respects that he's gone, I certainly don't think that this is a just outcome by any means. And that says a lot about our political system, to be honest, Dotun.
And you can tell us what the Centre for Education and Youth is later on. You'll have opportunity to perhaps expand on that a little bit more, if you don't mind. Well, here with you is Albie Amankona, who's the co-founder of Conservatives Against Racism for Equality. Albie, how do you see this? Are you glad to see the back of Boris Johnson?
I wouldn't say glad to see the back of Boris Johnson, but I do think it's time for the Conservative Party to move on from Boris Johnson. He's a very good campaigner. He was a huge electoral asset in 2019, also during his time as the Mayor of London, of course, and he has had a very successful political career, but unfortunately, the past 3 years have really tarnished that, and the last 12 months in particular, with the entire Partygate scandal. And I think he's done the right thing by stepping down as the MP for his constituency.
How can we move on from Boris Johnson? I'm sure the Conservative Party would love us too. And in fact, Grant Shapps said that earlier on, didn't he? He said that we, and he was talking about the broader we, the great British public, have moved on from Boris Johnson. Clearly we haven't, if he's on all the front pages. And we can't move on, can we, from the pandemic, first of all, and his role in the pandemic, etc. Can't move on from that, particularly the people who have lost loved ones and so on. Is it a little bit ungracious to suggest that we can move on?
No, I don't think it's ungracious to suggest that we can move on from Boris Johnson. I think the coverage of Boris Johnson resigning has been a little bit over the top and a bit dramatic. People talking about the Tories in turmoil. It's going to cause a split within the Conservative Party. It's going to destroy Rishi Sunak. I think all of that commentary is really overcooked. I actually think this is beneficial for Rishi Sunak. He'll be very pleased that he no longer has an enemy on the backbenches. There's no focal point on the backbenches for dissent anymore. So I actually think this is good for the Prime Minister. The by-elections are going to be a pain and they're going to be tricky. But ultimately, I think Rishi Sunak and the team at number 10 will have made the calculation that it's better for him that Boris is out of Parliament than in Parliament.
OK, 0800 731 2000. You've now met both of our paper reviewers this evening. Albie Amankona there, co-founder of Conservatives Against Racism for Equality, but also Baz Ramaya, who's the head of policy at the Centre for Education and Youth. If you want to talk to them directly as well, then engage. Yeah, pick up the phone, 0800 731 2000. My good friend Lenny in Ashford, in fact, the voice of reason on our programme, is with us now. So, Lenny, good evening.
Now, I must ask you, I'm ever so sorry, I put my loudspeaker on and I'm having difficulty turning it off. So can you hear me plain enough?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, but that's it. All right, But anyway, I think Jake spoke more truth than Boris has ever done.
Jake in Orpington, our first caller this evening.
What he said earlier, he did speak a lot of truth, which is something that, Boris, we all know, is his weakness. And apart from what Jake said, I think there is a danger that not too many people are paying the attention to it that it needs, and that is our national debt. Now, can I explain the value of a pound, Dotun?
Please do, yes.
Right. £1 billion is if you stood on a street corner and every half an hour gave somebody £1 to buy a cup of tea, you would have enough money to buy Jesus a dinner. Now,
Sorry, to buy what for dinner?
Jesus a dinner.
Oh, Jesus a dinner. Okay.
Yeah, so that is the value of £1 billion. Now, £1 trillion is, with our national debt heading towards £3 trillion, if we paid £1 off every second, it would take over 100 years to pay the debt.
Yeah.
Now, that is frightening. And all we got for all that money that we're in debt for, Boris has got to take a big hand in this. What have we got for our money for all the debt that the Conservatives have created? Very, very little.
Yeah, but they would argue it's the times, old boy, the times that we was living in. The debt was accrued during the difficult times of the pandemic.
I'm trying to tell you the value of £1 trillion.
Sure.
If we took the Ukraine war and COVID and all the expenses that has cost us, £1 trillion would pay that comfortably, and you'd have enough change to give the nurses a rise in their wage packet.
Well, just hold that thought. Stay with us, because we've got both Baz and Albie with us as well. Just on that thought, for example, on if we hadn't engaged in the Ukrainian war, we'd have a little bit of change left over. Baz, could we have avoided not supporting Ukraine financially or militarily, whichever way it's costing us? Could we have avoided, could the government have just said, look, we can't afford it, and walked away from that, do you think?
I mean, Boris Johnson was, of course, one of the first people within NATO, one of the first leaders to speak in defense of Ukraine, to pledge British military support, both through arms exports to Ukraine, but also surveillance support and other security support. It was framed at the time, and I think quite accurately, as being a way of him restoring some degree of, strength and authority and nobility and morality to like his public perception, given all that was going on around the time in terms of Partygate and that kind of thing. Britain is one of the biggest contributors financially to arming Ukraine, and I don't think we should forget about that. And I do think that money could be better invested at home. That's something we do need to take really seriously. But I don't think we should also overstate how much the cost of making some of the changes that your caller was just talking about. Let's take, for example, like increasing public sector pay, right, to put it in line with inflation. According to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, that would cost around about £10 billion to do for all of the public sector. Now, that's an amount of money that's certainly not to be sniffed at, but it's certainly an amount of money that the government can put together through various programs of taxation and redirection of funding within government. So I don't think we should see it as necessarily this either or. And that's the kind of economic thinking I think we should try and avoid, because that's the kind of economic thinking the government wants to take.
But you do think that we could morally have walked away from any responsibility in supporting Ukraine against the aggression of Russia, do you?
Well, I think there's a difference between the sort of support that's being given by other countries, which is is both financial, and the amount of support that we're giving, which is extremely large, right? Like proportionate to other countries. That's of course because of there are several large arms companies in this country that are a big part of British industry. They have enormous lobbying power in Westminster, particularly British BAE systems, and we have to keep in mind that that's part of why our contribution to arming Ukraine is as large as it is. So yeah, in that respect, I think that money could be better spent elsewhere.
Albie, are you chomping at the bit to come back on this?
I'm not sure I agree with Baz on this one. I think the government, Boris Johnson and Ben Wallace at the time, would have made the calculation that it's cheaper to support and arm Ukraine than let Russia invade Ukraine successfully and then invade Poland, which of course is a NATO country, and then NATO would be at war with Russia, and that would be a hot war in Europe between NATO and Russia, which could turn nuclear, which would be tens, if not hundreds of times more expensive, both financially and in terms of loss of life, than arming Ukraine against their invasion from Russia right now. I think it was the right decision to make. I do think as the war rumbles on, there are going to be more conversations about just how long is this commitment going to last for? Can we afford to keep on arming Ukraine in the same way that we have? Is it time to start thinking about some sort of peace negotiations? I think those conversations will go on, but I think Baz is completely wrong to say that it would be morally fine for us not to arm Ukraine, because I actually think had we not armed Ukraine, had the US not done the same thing, we would have been facing a much more grave situation here in Europe.
Can I
Lenny.
say something, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think possibly you've misunderstood me. I truly believe that it was good to stand by Ukraine. My argument is, of the nearly £3 trillion we are in debt, is that what if you took £1 trillion to pay for the Ukraine war and to pay for COVID, that leaves nearly £2 trillion that the government has spent, and we got nothing to show for it. That is my argument. I'm not arguing against the expense of the Ukraine war, but what I'm saying, this government...
We've got nothing to show for it.
We got nothing to show for it. The only people that have got something to show for it are the contracts that the Conservative Party have been giving out for them to earn a fortune.
Yeah, we might come back to that conversation in a moment as well if we have time. Tell me this, because I remember you saying in the last several calls we've had that you are politically homeless. Was it Boris Johnson? Yes. Was it Boris Johnson that made you politically homeless? What's his role in your homelessness politically?
Well, I have never, ever voted for anybody else but a Conservative in my life. And I learned some years ago that any Conservative that I have dealt with in the town where I come from, in Ashford in Kent, where Damien Green is my MP, and when I've gone to them to discuss Conservative policy to create jobs, it didn't mean anything. There was no... all it was empty words. And all the jobs I created, it was not done with any help from a Conservative.
Okay, just very quickly, what do you think, and we are talking about Boris Johnson's legacy to a certain extent, what do you think his legacy is going to be? If you can sum up his legacy in half a sentence, if you can, will it be COVID? Will it be Brexit? Will it be the economic mess, if you like, that he put us into?
Well, he's what you have just said is, if I tell you what to do is try and find a legacy where Boris has left this country better off.
That's a good point. That's what I'll do tonight. And thank you, Lenny in Ashford. We're looking for a legacy, a Boris Johnson legacy, where Boris formerly the MP for Uxbridge and South Ruislip until this weekend, where Boris has left the country better off. 0800 731 2000. If you can think of one, give me a call, pick up the phone, let's talk now. Our paper reviewers this evening, Baz Ramaya, who's the head of policy at the Centre for Education and Youth. Just remind us, what does the policy what does the Centre for Education and Youth actually do?
So we're an organisation who conduct research all over the country into what's going on in schools, what's young people's experience of the world, and how we can improve that, both at a policy level and at a practice level. So we do research, but we also do some action as well. And our main aim is to create a society in which all young people can make a fulfilling transition to adulthood. That's our commitment.
Yeah, and Albie Amankona is the co-founder of Conservatives Against Racism for Equality. I always feel it demands a question. Why? Why do we need an organisation about conservatives, or an organisation called Conservatives Against Racism for Equality?
Well, because I felt that it was important after the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, which is when I co-founded Conservatives Against Racism for Equality with my colleague Siobhan Aarons, that there was a conservative approach to anti-racism in Britain that I'm afraid I don't think I was seeing coming out of the Black Lives Matter protests. You know, there was a lot of division that was soaked up during that time, which I don't think was helpful. There was also a lot of strong feelings as well. And I wanted a centre-right organisation to make a difference.
Ben in Clacton is with us. Good evening, Ben.
Hello, Dotun. How are you going?
Very well, thank you very much. We're looking for one policy that Boris Johnson is responsible for that has made this country better. Can you think of any?
There isn't any.
There's none whatsoever?
No, there isn't any. At last, a Conservative can actually admire that chap you've got on at the moment.
Albie?
Yes.
Thank you.
And yes. I've admired very few Conservatives. The last Conservative I admired was Harold Macmillan. Super Mac.
Yeah, for those who don't know, the guy with the bicycle handlebar moustache.
Yes, and he built 300,000 odd houses every year for people to live in.
It was easier in them days, wasn't it? It was easier because you had so many.
It wasn't. I mean, the technology. I've worked on building sites and you used to have to dig a hole with a shovel. Not with a machine.
You're absolutely right. I've worked on one of those. I remember digging a hole with a pickaxe. I seem to remember. And I could only do it for one day. Then I gave up the job.
It was a lot of hard work. I mean, they used to dig me out occasionally because my boots got stuck in the mud.
Yeah, of course.
So they'd come over and they'd dig me out and carry me out to the...
Do you remember those little kind of like tents that they used to all huddle in if it rained, the road workers?
That's right. That's right.
They're kind of a non-military version of those air raid shelter things that people had in their back gardens during the Second World War, if you remember.
They were, and the billy cans that were no good if they were brand new. Unless they were actually black with tannin from the tea.
Perhaps that's enough.
The building site people didn't like them.
Perhaps that's enough of our ancient reminiscences. Let's move on to modern times then. So you can't think of one thing that Boris has done. What do you think his legacy is going to be then? He's got several potential legacies, hasn't he?
Well, lying, corruption, nepotism, just about everything, every bad thing under the sun. And getting away with it was people believed the lies, and many people died because of it. I think during the pandemic, because you and I had a long history. It's when I started to talk to you was 2020 in March, and you and I can remember the pile of bodies high and all the 80-year-olds are worthless.
Well,
all of that sort of stuff.
But
and
the imagery is not correct. The imagery is not correct. There was no pile of bodies high. But, in terms of stats,
it was very similar to that. Yeah. And a lot of his colleagues said he actually said it. So, but the alleged corruption will come out and Boris will be back. He'll be back. He'll go into one of these extreme right-wing programs where the climate change deniers and all that sort of thing, GB News, all that sort of stuff. He'll get on one of them, and he'll survive, and he'll end up. He's a survivor. He's a fantastic survivor.
Why do you think he resigned? Why do you think he resigned then? Rather than coming back, why not just stay where you are?
Well, he's famous for not planning anything, but this thing I think he's planned. And when Richie Sunak goes down, and he'll make sure he goes down, with all the statements that he can bring out, all the information he's got, he'll drip all of that up, right up into the election, so it ensures that the Conservatives lose heavily. And they're showing that at the moment. The government are actually trying to hide the information that would sink them. And you've got to remember,
well,
Boris
that's what you'd expect, wouldn't you?
He was not on his own.
Yeah.
And all of this, he was not on his own. He wasn't the only one to blame. Richie Sunak was around at the time, and he was Chancellor of the Exchequer when $4 billion...
Mate, I'm not arguing with you about any of that, but we'll see what the impact of him also being part of the conversation. No, I was thinking we'll see what the impact of Rishi Sunak being part of that conversation around Partygate will have on these by-elections. You know, remember, I mean, I don't know how worried you are, Albie, but these by-elections, they range from very, very safe Tory seats to, well, perhaps the most precarious of them being Uxbridge and South Ruislip. But even there's a majority of several thousand. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. I think the by-elections are going to be a trouble point for Rishi Sunak. There's a potential that all three by-elections could be lost, or there's a potential that maybe none of them will be lost. We don't know what will happen until those by-elections happen. But one of the things that I think we have to remember when we talk about by-elections and whether or not that's going to lead to the Tories winning or losing the next general election, if you can cast your mind back to 2019, before the 2019 general election, the European elections, the Conservatives did incredibly badly in the European elections and then went on to win that historic 80-seat majority in December of the same year. So I don't think we should read too much into these by-elections. I think the media will make a lot of noise about it, but ultimately what matters is general election either next year or the year after.
Why stop at 2019? That's not going back far enough. If you go back to 1997, Tony Blair winning that election, that was followed by a series of by-election defeats by the Conservatives. So if you look at that point in history, it doesn't bode well going forward. In fact, it bodes a disaster ahead. I'm not saying there will be, but don't be selective with your picking out history. Let's cover the whole thing. Stay with us 1 second, Ben, because I do want to get Baz's thoughts on this as well. Ben was pointing out that, look, Boris Johnson's going to be back. And I said, well, why did he resign? What are your thoughts on the strategy here, if you like, whether it's a strategy for Boris Johnson or for the wider Conservative Party? What's going on?
I mean, I suspect that his decision to resign at the time that he did, like before the publication of the report he read, or before any vote against him in the House of Commons or indeed in the by-election, that was presumably an attempt by him to be able to control the narrative, because he's obviously issued the statement which is saying his side of what he thinks is in the report. And unfortunately, I suspect that the statement hasn't quite worked in his favour, because it does smack of, quite an intense level of desperation. And ultimately, it's a statement that's being delivered to a public that probably not that receptive, to be honest. I mean, Snap polling showed that 60% of the public, support his decision to resign. The last time it was polled, 75% of the public regard him as untrustworthy. There's polling from Delta Poll, there's modelling from Delta Poll showing that.
Hello? Oh, we seem to have lost Baz for a moment. Ben, final word to you then, in this respect. You say that he will be back. Will he be back sooner rather than later?
No, I think he'll wait until the defeat of the next election.
Okay.
And he'll then join go as a candidate for a Conservative association. And whoever's in charge will actually find it very difficult to stop him, because once a Conservative association has elected a candidate to stand in a safe seat, for instance, then he'll come back. And all the right wingers like Sue Ella Barthelman and all of them, she's been conspicuous for her absence over the last month or so.
Well,
but anyway,
watch this space. Suella Braverman will be back. I dare say she's Home Secretary after all. Ben, I've got to leave it there. And thank you very much. Appreciate your thoughts on all of this. Let's move on the stories now. For both of you, Baz and Albie, the idea, I mean, we start talking about elections, perfect time then to talk about the Tory shortlist for Mayor of London. Oh, and by the way, did you say our good mate, BBC Radio London's good mate, but also this programme's good mate, Sean Bailey, is now Lord Sean Bailey. Because he stood for election last time against Rishi Sunak and lost, but he's been elevated to the House of Lords now. Something that you welcome, Baz?
I mean, I'm not surprised that his name made it through on the list, although I'm certainly not his biggest fan. But okay. I mean, thinking about these forthcoming London mayoral elections, like, I really don't think the Conservatives should be putting any of their effort into this. If I was being honest, I don't.
Why not?
I mean, okay, if I was in the Conservative Party right now, I'd be looking to just shore up my base. Like, who are the people who are most likely to vote for the Conservative Party? And how can we retain those people? How can we reinvigorate their support in this current crisis? I think it's pretty safe to say at this point that London is not the Conservative Party's base. There's a poll by YouGov not that long ago that showed that Labour have a 40-point lead on the Conservatives in London for the mayoral elections, which is the highest that they've had since 2010. So if I was the Conservatives, I'd be looking at other mayoralities like the West Midlands, where they're more likely to win. I think London, particularly given all the other issues they're grappling with at the moment, they just need to see that as a bit of a lost cause, to be honest.
Let's see if there are any Conservative voters out there who may not agree entirely with you. What Baz is saying is don't bother. Don't bother. If you're Tory in London, don't bother. Because that's
total nonsense. It's complete nonsense. I mean, you talk about how Labour allegedly has a 40-point lead over the Conservatives in London. Well, what good is that doing for London? Sadiq Khan is expanding ULEZ, which barely anyone wants. We've got super high crime rates in London. We've got all of these low traffic neighbourhoods that people are very unhappy with. And the fact that London seems to be this unwinnable city for anyone else other than Labour is not exactly serving Londoners very well, because Sadiq Khan has got carte blanche to make very unpopular decisions that are affecting the people of outer London who are more likely to vote Conservative.
Baz?
Well, I mean, when we're engaged in politics, it's always a case of having finite resources and how we distribute those, right? And the Conservatives are in a situation where they have a lot of people that they need to win back over. And you may say that it's a political agenda. So you may say that it's a policy agenda from Sadiq Khan that you disagree with, but a 40-point lead is broadly unprecedented. So it's not something that the electorate aligns with you on, right?
Are you saying that expanding the ULEZ out from the North Circular to the M25 is a policy which is popular with people in outer London?
I know that 75% of Londoners say that they think that dealing with air pollution is a major political priority. And I'm not sure about whether literacy about ULEZ and how it works is sufficiently high for the those who have been polled to have a strong opinion on it. I know that there is lots of disinformation actively pushed by organisations around it, but I do think that is at least some endorsement of the of ULEZ activity. And then, of course, we're looking at the fact that a very large number of Londoners are saying that they would prefer to vote for the Labour Party over the Conservatives. If your argument is around popularity around this policy agenda, then there's the argument.
No, I disagree. If you ask people, do you want cleaner air? Of course they're going to say yes. I would say yes to that question. But I would also say
they're saying it's a political priority. They're not just saying they like it. They're saying it's a political priority.
Yes, I would argue that having cleaner air is a political priority. Of course, everyone wants cleaner air, but the way that you introduce cleaner air is not necessarily through expanding the ULEZ zone from the North and South Circular to the M25, which is a policy which is very unpopular in outer London. When I go out on the doorsteps, when I'm campaigning for the Conservative Party, one of the main things that I'm hearing on the doorsteps is, we hate ULEZ.
Well, we know that one of the biggest campaigners against ULEZ, one of the biggest lobbying blocks here, are organisations that either are or are strongly affiliated with fossil fuel companies or the transport industry. Sorry, not the transport industry, the automobile industry. Now, the Conservative Party is very, very cosy, in particular, with fossil fuel companies. Last year alone, they took £3.5 million from fossil fuel companies. So we can see here that while there may be some legitimate arguments there, there's also a powerful lobby here that's pushing things in the interest of fossil fuel companies. So I'm going to read that with a level of suspicion.
Read what with a level of suspicion?
Oh, the argument that ULEZ is particularly unpopular or is a particularly bad policy, when we know one of the main blocks that's pushing the idea that it's a bad policy is the fossil fuel industry.
You're suggesting that the people that I've spoken to on the doorsteps of outer London are unable to make up their own minds about whether or not they think ULEZ is a bad policy because it's going to make it more expensive for them to run their businesses, drop their children off at school, go to hospital appointments. They're going to have to change their cars. You don't think they're able to just make that decision themselves without being lobbied by an oil and gas company? That sounds quite insulting to me.
It's not for me to talk about the individual conversations that you have on your doorsteps because I can't comment on those because I wasn't there for those. But I can talk about the wider context.
These people can't make up their own mind.
I can talk about the wider context here, which is that one of the major lobbies pushing against ULEZ are fossil fuel companies whose interest here is not in people's health, is not in the well-evidenced negative impact on people's health that toxic air has. It's on their profits and their bottom lines. That's the broader context I'm trying to bring in. Not these conversations you have on the doorstep that I don't have access to, and frankly, no one listening to this has access to verify.
Well, you don't have to have access to it. Albie's just making the point that this is his experience, and it's great to have somebody's eyewitness report actually from the doorstep. And all political parties thrive on that, to know what's going on out there. You don't have to be present for it to be an argument. However, I think it's fair to say that one of the main lobby groups against or in favour of ULEZ are scientists. And there was an open letter to the Prime Minister from scientists asking him to tell his party not to discredit toxic air science. Leading scientists urge the Prime Minister to tell your party colleagues to stop discrediting scientific facts about toxic air. In a letter, they accuse politicians in Parliament and the London Assembly of not believing the science. We ask you to join us in making the case for urgent action on air pollution, they say to Rishi Sunak. The government said it delivered significant improvements in air quality, but said there is more to do. And this comes amid all this controversy about the expansion of ULEZ as well. Neil Garrett, who's the Assembly member, leader of the Conservatives at London City Hall, said the party was committed to reducing air pollution and it was irresponsible to conflate opposition to the ULEZ expansion with science denial. I think that's a fair point. Isn't it, Baz? That we have to stay clear of the danger of conflating the opposition to ULEZ that we talked about now with the science denial. Do you know what I mean? Science denial is one thing, but the opposition to ULEZ, certainly as Albie's been outlining it, is something completely different. We have to keep those things apart. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's true. And I think this is one of the interesting lessons from the pandemic, right? Is that there's not typically like a neat and tidy one-to-one relationship between the science and what we should do from a policy perspective. I think it's worth remembering that a lot of the organizations who are lobbyists against ULEZ do have links to organizations that aggressively deny climate change. There is a wider web here of what is going on with ULEZ opposition, which is what I'm trying to draw attention to, beyond individual conversations that have been had on doorsteps.
Fair enough. Kate is with us in Tufnell Park. Great to speak to you, Kate. Good evening. How are you?
Hello, I'm all right, thank you.
Good.
I was listening to your two guests.
Mm-hmm. Albie,
I'm a Londoner.
Yeah.
Through and through.
Yeah,
I am horrified that no one is supporting the rest of us who don't actually like the Mayor of London.
Oh.
And all of his... I don't actually like what he's doing to London. And it seems like people are just giving up and giving him another 4 years without any fight.
Is there
can't be happening.
I love the way you put it. Is there any particular thing that the mayor's doing to London that you...
Everything.
Yeah, everything.
I'm a Londoner through and through. I don't even want to go out in London anymore. That's
Because of the
done to
mayor?
me. Yeah. The mayor, things the mayor have done over the last 8 years have made London unbearable. It's just unbearable. I'd have to write you a list because I get so angry, I can't do it off the top of my head. But the point is, I don't want to go in there anymore. When I go in, it's a chore. I go to the bank, go to John Lewis, and go home because I can't stand the rest of it that's going on. And I just want someone to go against the mayor or put up a fight. For a start off, this environment
Who
stuff.
is there? Who is... Sorry, go on. You talk about the environment.
It doesn't have to be a Conservative.
No.
It can be an independent.
But it's most likely to be a Conservative. You know, when was the last time an independent won? Arguably, Ken Livingstone was an independent, wasn't he? Arguably.
But we've got to get behind somebody. It's got to be someone who's got enthusiasm.
Well,
you know, a footballer or somebody that wants to...
There's no footballers on the list so far, but these are the people that the Conservatives are putting up.
That list is ridiculous, all right?
Right.
No one on that list is going to win. I can tell you that now.
Daniel Korski,
none
number
of them
10
are going to win.
Number 10, Susan Hall,
No.
London Assembly member,
No.
Muzamil Hussain, barrister.
No. Even Sean Bailey would have had a better chance.
Wow, and he's now
Lord. Now he's a Lord. But he did have... He was really good.
Yeah.
You know, and he didn't lose by that much. But the thing is, things like, they go on about the environment. Why isn't somebody saying we don't need that other runway at Heathrow? Why isn't someone going up against that? That's why I don't like Boris, because he didn't lay in on a runway. You know? Why do we need another runway? You ask any pilot that flies into Heathrow, they'll tell you what's needed, and it's not another runway. It's another HS2 ridiculous situation that's going to happen.
Okay.
It makes me sick.
And
so we need somebody with a bit of oomph to get going.
Albie, this is a cry for you, and stay with us, Kate. Please stay with us, because I'm going to ask both, Albie and also Baz to comment on what you've said. But Albie, Kate, Londoner through and through, is crying out for some opposition. Last time you put up Sean Bailey, he lost by 200,000 votes to Sadiq Khan. What does that tell you? It tells you that Londoners want Sadiq Khan, surely, or it tells you that you lot haven't put up anybody with substance. And as Kate says, you know, at least Sean Bailey had a little bit of name recognition.
I actually think Sean Bailey performed a lot better at the last London mayoral elections than many of us were expecting. And I think it's a shame that Conservative Party central headquarters didn't get behind him more strongly, because I actually think Sean Bailey really could have taken advantage of some of the discontent caused over the low traffic neighbourhoods that were being brought in at the time. And what the Conservative Party needs to do now is take advantage of some of this dissent that I'm hearing on the doorsteps about you, Les. Now, I do think one of the three candidates who the Conservative Party has selected could potentially be the person to do that when the vote is taken to the people at some point in the future. I'll actually be going to the London hustings, so I'll be meeting all of those candidates on Friday, next Friday. So I'll be asking them the questions that Londoners want to hear. But I think it is time for a change.
And will you decide which one of those three you will support after the hustings? Will you decide yourself who you will support?
Yes, so I'll be deciding after the hustings who I will be supporting, and then I think it goes out to a vote to the Conservative Party members.
Meanwhile, Baz, remember Kate's a Londoner through and through, and she's just charged the mayor, Sadiq Khan, with making London unbearable for her. What say you?
I mean, so I think that there are sort of shortcomings of Sadiq Khan. He's perhaps not my favourite mayor in the world, but I think there are things that he's certainly gotten right. I think on the issue of expansion of Heathrow, adding in another runway, completely with you, Kate. Or this is something that Sadiq Khan has opposed. I think he's not been strong enough in his opposition to this, and he really needed to stand up to the aviation industry on this one in a way that he didn't. I think a recent thing that I heartily endorse as someone who works in education is that Sadiq Khan is pioneering a rollout of free school meals for all primary school pupils in London. That is potentially going to be incredibly significant in fighting this epidemic of child food insecurity that we're seeing in this country. At present, the number of young people, this is admittedly across the UK, who are in food poverty has doubled. We now have 4 million children in this country who are going into school hungry every single day.
Let me put that to Kate.
It's a great idea.
It's a policy, Kate. It's a shame that you're not at school age anymore because...
I'm 77 now. It's one of Mr. Khan's tricks. I think the last trick he did on the last one was the bus drivers. It's just a trick. He's very clever at tricks. I need someone to be trickier.
I love the way you got away with words. I'll give you that, Kate. And thank you very much. Kate in Tufnell Park needs somebody to be trickier than the Mayor Sadiq Khan. Any offers? 0800 731 2000. Who could be trickier than Sadiq Khan? Albie, I know that you wanted to talk about Nicola Sturgeon. Yeah, why?
Well, I just think it's quite poignant that the former leader of the Scottish National Party, Nicola Sturgeon, has been arrested because of all of the shenanigans that's been going on with the SNP.
She was arrested, but she's been released now.
Arrested and released. That's still pretty unprecedented.
Yeah,
It's not often. It's not something that you see very often.
The President of the United States.
A former First Minister of Scotland being arrested and then released. You know, it's just quite poignant. And I think actually, if we are looking at the SNP ahead of the next general election and what kind of the SNP's fall means for the next general election, it actually makes it a lot easier for Labour to win the next election because, of course, in order to secure a parliamentary majority, Labour needs Scotland, and now it seems that the SNP have fallen in Scotland at the same time as the Tories seem to be polling quite badly in England.
And Baz, goodness gracious, Nicola Sturgeon... SNP, Nicola Sturgeon, they say, by the way, that they're going to make life hard for Labour in Scotland as well, but they've got problems of their own. How did they get themselves in this mess, from your point of view?
I mean, for me, I should add that I completely agree with Albie. This is an opportunity for Labour in the sense that the SNP are in disarray and they're their primary rival in Scotland. No surprise there that Keir Starmer's calling for a general election now under those circumstances. I think the fundamental issue here, Dotun, is that financial impropriety is just widespread across our political class. And the reason that I think this story is important is because it shows that financial impropriety, corruption more broadly, isn't just an issue with Boris Johnson. It's not an issue with just an issue with the Conservative Party or indeed Westminster generally. It's an issue that plagues our political system overall. And if we want to deal with the cause of that corruption rather than just the symptoms, then we need to be talking about systemic reform of our institutions, not just changing the leaders of our parties. So to answer your question, it's because that is how politics works in this country.
It's a fair point, though, isn't it, Albie? If Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, can be fined for criminality, as unprecedented as that was for a Prime Minister, it does beg the question if there isn't something much more fundamental about our political system that needs to be reformed rather than just look at her, she's been arrested, look at him, he's been fined.
Well, I think one of the quirks of the British political system is there are a lot of conventions that aren't written down and essentially just operate under a gentleman's agreement, if you will. And then as soon as you get a leader who is not a gentleman and does not honour those gentlemen's agreements, they just all fall apart. And that's what we saw with Boris Johnson. That's what we've seen with Nicola Sturgeon. And we've not seen that with British prime ministers before. So maybe now is the time for reform, or maybe political parties need to make better decisions as who they pick as as their leaders.
I do love the way you put that, honest and general. I didn't mean to laugh at that. I was like, gentlemen, for goodness sake, will the first gentleman please stand up in the house? Nobody?
I'm standing up, Dotun.
But you're not in the house.
No, I'm not. Not yet.
Or you could be in the house in a kind of a hip-hop way, but you're not in the house where it matters, as it were. And that's a fair point, though, Baz. Once upon a time, you could rely on these people to be trustworthy, truthfully, and to be gentlemen as well. You just can't find a gentleman for love or money anymore, can you?
I mean, I think porousness of the premiership of the executive to financial interests is an issue that long predates Boris Johnson. I mean, even if we go back to the government before this current iteration of the Conservative government, if we go back to New Labour, we see so many instances of this, right? We see like the Eccleston affair, we see cash for questions, cash for access, we see all the stuff that happened with Peter Mandelson. We see Blair acting as a lobbyist of BAE Systems, like constantly in his engagement abroad. So
listen,
I think the issue goes much deeper than that.
You've listed them all, and thank you very much. Baz Ramai, the head of policy at the Centre for Education and Youth, and also thanks to Albie Amankona, co-founder of Conservatives Against Racism for Equality.